Well, if you're a newspaper and you're not making a profit, why not become a nonprofit? Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle now. And Bill, the Salt Lake Tribune has successfully appealed to the IRS to become a nonprofit organization, a kind of an educational entity, as it were. The owner of the Tribune is actually going to transfer his ownership to a board of directors. And the editor-in-chief of the paper said pretty much nothing's going to change. In fact, the IRS didn't even place any restrictions upon this new nonprofit newspaper as far as making that transition to a nonprofit status. They don't have to change their coverage, what they cover, how they cover it, or anything like that. Bill, it occurs to me that perhaps journalism would be a lot better off without the taint of capitalism and the way that profit-making organizations can influence the news. Doesn't this make you feel good about the future of the Fourth Estate?
Well, I basically, when I leave the studio here, I go back home and I put on my morning coat and tails and my top hat, and I grab my two big sacks with dollar signs on it. Then I relax on a pile of golden coins. So it doesn't actually appeal to me, this loss of capitalism. I feel a terrible mistake has been made.
Well, you would think it'd be less biased, don't you think? Because now it's a nonprofit.
Look, I've set up two nonprofits, and there's a couple questions here. I just want to deal with the specifics, and I'll get to the bigger issue. One of the 501c3s I have set up its charitable purpose is to educate the American people on history, culture, and things of that nature. One thing that if I understand the law correctly, I can talk about politics. The only thing I'm not allowed to do with a 501c3 is I cannot endorse a specific candidate. I think if you're going to endorse a specific candidate, you have to be a 501c4, which is what virtually all of the fundraising
political action committees.
Yeah, right. So I suppose the question becomes. I thought, well, there's no way that they could do that, but as long as the editorial board of the paper does not issue an endorsement for a specific candidate, I suppose they're in 501c3 territory, and I actually find this interesting. I'm not shocked by it, and I'm not outraged by it. Although God knows, if you give me a few minutes, I can find a way to be. It is a new model. It's a new model for newspapers, because the old model is obsolete and dying. If the old model of commercial advertising was still working, then we wouldn't be talking about this. But once the internet came along, those of you who are above a certain age remember the Sunday classifieds, where if you wanted to sell something, everybody put everything up at the same time, and if you got the phone call in first, you were the lucky winner. But with the loss of ad revenues, classified ads and paid ads and so on, they cannot stay afloat. Now, to the question of whether or not this will make them less biased, I'm inclined to say it won't. In fact, I'm inclined to say it's probably going to make them a little more biased. And here's why. If they're going to be going to a donation-based model, people tend not to donate to things that they feel kind of about, Okay. In order to appeal to a donor base, you have to provide something that activates that donor base to the point where they feel like, okay, it's important for me to give money to this. And fair coverage doesn't do that unless they were to specifically advertise that. If they were to basically going to say, we talked about this a little while ago, but 6 cents more on a can of tuna for so you don't kill a fish that thinks. If they were to specifically say, we've abandoned our advertising model, we've abandoned all of this, we are now we are now a nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing as fair and as balanced news report as can be possibly generated, that might actually generate some real interest. I would, if I looked at it and found out that over 4 or 5 months it was true, I would contribute to that.
Do you really think there are a lot of people out there who would say, honey, let's liquidate some stock? I hear that there's somebody who's going to give equal time and emphasis to our political opponents in their newspaper.
If they were savvy enough to do that, number one, and they're not. If they were inclined to do that, number two, and they're not. But if they did it, they would have to provide, certainly to me and to most other Americans who have utterly 100% not only lost confidence in the mainstream news media, but consider them outright enemies of our political position and, frankly, outright enemies of everything that America has traditionally stood for. But if they were to go 6 months, let's say, and you found that just even like a computer analysis or something found that the coverage of Donald Trump was pretty much 50-50, or even 60-40, you're always going to be more critical of a president than supportive. That's not the job of a newspaper to be the booster of a president. The job of newspapers to root out crime and corruption and all the rest of it. But if it were to turn out that after 6 months, the Tribune was to become a newspaper instead of an opinion rag, and they had the sense to advertise it that way, I would definitely make a $100 donation to that organization. I'd probably do it every year.
Well, the Salt Lake Tribune seems to be the only paper in the country that's gone full-on not-for-profit. However, the New York Times and, the Seattle Times both have foundations. The Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Tampa Bay Times both receive assistance from nonprofit organizations. The Knight Foundation, KNIGHT, is, of course, a major public policy and philanthropic organization that contributes to good journalism. The Washington Post has a partnership with a not-for-profit organization that helps it do reporting.
Called the New York Times.
Yeah. In-depth political reporting. And so I guess we're seeing this whole move because Facebook and Twitter and all these, and Google and all these other organizations have come along and have robbed the treasury that used to belong to, as you mentioned, classified advertising, but also display advertising. Bill, it doesn't seem like it's too big of a remove from going nonprofit to going government-supported nonprofit. How do you feel about that?
Well, that's an entirely different story, obviously. And let's just say that the Republicans controlled all three branches of the government, and we decided some newspaper came to us, some conservative newspaper, like I imagine Salt Lake Tribune is, and said, we want public subsidies. We're going to be, and if we get them, we will give you favorable news coverage. I would throw those people out on their ear. Of course, that's integrity.
Well, and the editor of the Tribune distinctly says that this will not happen. The integrity, she said, and I'm giving a quote here, the integrity of our reporting and our values as a news organization won't change, but we will engage with the community in new ways and ask for their support.
I have to tell you, Scott, since I sleep through most of the questions when you're asking them, I at first thought it was the Chicago Tribune. And so when I said they won't do it, they won't do it. Salt Lake, Utah is probably the most sensible state in the union. It's in the top 5. And if Salt Lake, see that entire region, and a lot of this obviously has to do with the Mormons, but my experience with them personally, my personal experience has been that these people have credibility. They have credibility because the ones that I've met, and I've met several of them, acted with remarkable integrity. If the Salt Lake Tribune were to say, we are going to go to a nonprofit-based model and we will do our very best to make fair and unbiased reporting, I believe they would and could do it. I thought we were talking about the Chicago Trib there for a second, and that's just just sheer impossibility. But the thing about, I think that's most important about this is a stopgap measure. You know, this is like I don't know. I don't want to get into any terrible medical analogies or so on, but this is a reprieve if this model works, because certainly the print media is finished, and there's just no question about it. Sometimes you'll see a historical movie, either an old movie or a movie set in older times. And you'll see people on the bus, and there's a bustle of people, and they've got these gigantic sheets of paper in front of their faces instead of these tiny little devices. And when you think about how pervasive a newspaper was, and that was the only news you got, that's a model that goes back at least to the 1800s as a profitable business, a big business, and those days are gone. And what's interesting about that is that it seems to be that while the New York Times paper edition is going to go out of business along with the Washington Post and all the rest, just a matter of time, people do not seem to be willing to pay money to get that same information digitally. And I find that not only interesting, but tremendously liberating and very, very good for democracy.
Years ago, when I was working for a local public television affiliate, a local PBS affiliate, we did on-air fundraising. And while everybody liked to say that they give to public TV because of things like great educational children's programming, and back in the day, the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, where their set was made of just barely painted cardboard, and they hardly ever left the studio because they couldn't afford to send many reporters out to the field. While people said that, the donations really poured in when we did, during our fundraising festival, so-called, a Peter, Paul, and Mary concert. And that's when people really poured on the money. So one wonders how long newspapers are going to be able to survive, since the core of their mission is essentially the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, and they don't have much of the Peter, Paul, and Mary concert sort of programming.
Well, the newspapers are, I think, as we understand them, New York Times, Washington Post, and so on, LA Times, are finished. They're just basically, they're like a deer that's staggering in the woods to bleed out. They're done. They'd be in huge trouble if it was only the fact that we moved from an industrial age into an information age. The newspapers would be in huge trouble just on the basis of that alone. But when you throw in how much they have willfully and intentionally destroyed their credibility, which is essentially the only thing a newspaper is. Look, used to be, and I know the Times has always been biased, but just to play with the example, if I'm walking down the streets of New York and some guy says to me, hey, we just started a war with Red China, I'd say, okay. But if a guy standing next to me said, I'm a reporter for the New York Times, I'd like to get your opinion on this new war with Red China, there was a time when I would have given that guy a lot more credibility, because that's what he's selling. The newspaper brand was a sign of credibility. And that's why the Post always had kind of a tarnished reputation, especially in comparison with the Times. The Post is doing much better actual reporting now than the Times does. But once you've thrown credibility is a hard thing to earn. And it's an easy thing to lose, but it's virtually impossible to get it back again once you had it and then lost it. That process requires 3 or 4 times the work it would require to build credibility in the first place, because you had people trusting you, and then you basically stabbed them in the back. You betrayed them. And once somebody's been betrayed by a friend, it is much harder to get that friend to be a friend again than it would be to meet a new friend. So a combination of this entire enormous shift in the economics of the culture to the information age, the universal preponderance of personal devices that are capable of delivering anything you want to read at any given time right now, and the complete lack of credibility and destruction of their credibility, to me, means that newspapers, as we understand them, everybody should go buy a copy now. It's something I was going to say something you want to show your grandkids, but it's probably something you're going to want to show your younger brothers or sisters.
As I am pulling out my device right now and looking at a story that just posted this morning, actually, it says readers continue to shower the New York Times with money, advertisers not so much. The publisher added 273,000 new online subscribers in the third quarter for a total of 4 million digital readers. This new report came out. However, advertising fell 6.7% overall, and digital ad revenue dropped 5.4%. I saw an earlier story which I knew must be linked to something I hadn't heard about yet. The earlier story said that the New York Times expects to have 10 million online subscribers by 2025. And I thought, wow, that's kind of a long projection timeline. What's going on at the New York Times? Bill, I wonder if the New York Times will be able to get its not-for-profit application into the IRS fast enough to stave off the decline in ad dollars.
What you're basically saying is that the most famous newspaper in the history of the world, and at one time the most respected, has bet that it will be around in 5 years, and people are taking even money on that bet. So while the number is impressive, it doesn't seem to change my opinion on things. Look, the New York Times will have a diehard group of people. And strangely enough, I really, this is beneath me to say this, but I think we all know what they look like, kind of rumpled college professor types, and you get the idea. that will always, they'll pay for the New York Times until the New York Times is gone, because the New York Times provides them with a patina, provides their own opinions with a patina of respectability that was at one time absolutely monumental. And as they reached further and further and further into this pot of trust and integrity in order to advance their short-term agenda, that, well, Scott, it's like they're a trust fund kid that started, never spend the principal, right? Never. And that's what they did. They started spending the principal. They started spending the sum of money that's generating the interest that they live on. And once you start spending principal, that means that your payments get smaller and smaller and smaller every year because you have less money from which to draw interest. The same thing with the Times. Once you have enough credibility so that people think of you as the paper of record, then you will have a solid basis for whatever business enterprise you want to continue to do. But if it turns out you start spending principal by basically by paying out credibility, and maybe you lose the far right wing of Republicans, and you maybe say, well, maybe they never read us anyway. But there are certainly right-leaning moderates and centrists and left-leaning moderates and so on that are at risk. And I certainly, as a child, before I became political, I never doubted the New York Times. The idea that the New York Times would be biased is just seemed inconceivable to me. So certainly they have spent off virtually all of their credibility, and now they want to find a way to stay in business. And I do find it actually not only interesting and satisfying, but particularly apt that these organizations that once held huge vaults full of gold coins in terms of actual dollars, and even larger vaults full of gold coins in terms of believability, trust, and integrity, now find themselves adopting a model which frankly is sitting on the sidewalk, holding up a tin cup, shaking a couple pennies and say, buddy, can you spare a dime?
Well, while the New York Times reading trust fund babies were guided by the council to never spend the principal, the members at BillWhittle.com were guided by the financial wisdom that says,
get out there and get a job, man.
There's always
Start
money.
a business.
There's always money in the banana stand. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful for the fact that you have kept this banana stand, this mom and pop shop going and growing for so long. We have depended on the kindness of people who agree with our opinions, but also on people who don't agree with our opinions and who like the fact that we're not afraid to engage the opinions of the other side.
We may plead, but we would never beg.
And drawing that distinction is really what BillWhittle.com is all about.
It's the only way I can sleep at night.
When you go to BillWhittle.com, you can click that Become a Member link. You can also click the podcast link, by the way. And I'm finding that more and more people are excited about the fact that they can, on their commute to work or while they're exercising or while they're out taking care of the yard, they can actually listen to these shows without being distracted by the flapping of our gums. So if you go to BillWhittle.com, click that podcast link, and you'll find a way to hook up with your favorite podcast app. And it's, for those of you who don't know what podcasting is, it's like radio, except with a stupid word appended to it. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.